There is an Arabic saying, Worms Tier List Part 4. Here's the tier list so far, and here's a brief explanation of why they ended up where they were. Most of what we call worms are either flatworms, roundworms, segmented worms, or insect larvae, but there are a number of extra orders and a bunch of things that aren't even really animals, but still include the word worm. Let's kick things off with an old friend on this channel, the giant thorny-headed worm of swine. Was the runner-up for the best common name bracket, a member of a completely unique phylum. I suppose all phyla are unique, but this is the first representative on this list. Thorny-headed worms, or acanthocephala, or thorny-headed, are a group of worms with thorns on their heads. Once you get down to it, they're actually a pretty standard endoparasite. Not that that's a very standard life cycle, though. They have an intermediate host, which I wouldn't say is the default, but neither is just one definitive host. They're about as common. At this point, they're in a larval stage called an acanthor, which then develops into a cysticanth, which is then ingested by a large vertebrate. Now, because humans generally don't eat bugs, certainly not living bugs, we're not a major host. Livestock, pets, and probably wild animals are its definitive host, where it uses the thorns on its head to stick itself in the intestines and live there. Now, they don't really do much because they only live for a few weeks. As far as parasites go, they're fairly polite, but they are still intestinal parasites. They mate. Unlike tapeworms, they can't self-fertilize, so you have to ingest multiple of them at once, which means the intermediate host has to as well, which probably means they're all coming from the same clutch. So there's a lot of inbreeding, and also the males have special cement glands they use to plug up the females once they're done with them. Now, since the female is plugged up, she has to die and start decaying for the eggs to get out, but that's just kind of what maturity is in Semmelparus species. You mate once and die in like 3 days. So, some very gross mating habits on what is already an intestinal parasite. But isn't that name giant thorny-headed worm of swine really cool? So, C tier. Bobbit worms are a close relative of ragworms, often found in lower, more offshore benthic environments. They're an ambush predator, a kind of annelid, and they have a bunch of bristles and fangs, and nobody really cares about any of that because all anyone cares about is the name. So, how did it get the name Bobbit worm? Well, a woman named Bobbit cut her husband, also named Bobbit's, penis off. Yeah, actually that story was shorter than I expected. So back to the worm. I feel compelled to compare it to the ragworm, which was A tier. So the bobbit worm is predatory, feeding on fish, crustaceans, as opposed to the detritivorous ragworm. You might have seen videos of a freaky fanged worm launching itself out of burrows to nail a fish. Now, a lot of the ragworm's ranking came from it surviving the intertidal, which the bobbit worm doesn't really do. Then again, if you have to hide in saturated sediment, does that really count as surviving the low tide? I suppose another big part of it was the fangs, which the bobbit worm does even better. So I will match it in a high A tier. Now, a lot of these are going to be annelids or segmented worms because that's the only worm phylum that really has interesting and diverse entries. There's a reason it's the only one in S tier, which is why we now move on to the Pompeii worm. The term extremophile is virtually exclusive to single-celled organisms. There are a few exceptions like frogs that can freeze solid, shrimp that live in salt, desert ants, and deep-sea and Antarctic fish, and of course the Pompeii worm, which lives in boiling thermal vents. And even these are only at the beginning of what's possible for extremophiles. I should mention that water bears are not among these. They don't really live in extreme conditions. They kind of put their life on pause. They can tolerate them. Anyway, the Pompeii worm is a tube-building worm like the Christmas tree and giant tube, the main difference being instead of building their tubes in coral reefs or around thermal vents, they build them inside thermal vents. I think the Pompeii worm is the most famous extremophile, and yet it spends its life staring at more extreme extremophiles. It feeds on bacteria coming up from deeper in the vent, and it's not even extreme enough to survive its own habitat without symbiotic bacteria surrounding it. In that sense, it's kind of a dip in the Dunning-Kruger, where everyone loves water bears even though they don't even count as extremophiles, while the Pompeii worm knows how little it can actually tolerate. So, I will give it B tier, and the water bear gets F tier even though it's not a worm and isn't part of this list. Salps are also not worms by any definition, except mine, which is the most correct one, which is a long, squishy thing with no legs or face, so the salp fits that. Salps are weird. Their closest relatives are sea squirts, an invertebrate chordate that doesn't superficially resemble vertebrates. Now, on its own, a salp is just a moving sea squirt. It becomes a filter feeder instead of a suspension feeder, which is such a big difference. That's for the first generation. Salps have a very unique thing where they swap between asexually and sexually reproducing every generation. So on its own, a salp is asexual. If it runs into an algal bloom or anywhere else rich in nutrients, it can produce fully mature clones in 2 days, grow itself by 10% in an hour, and double in size every 8 hours. This creates a 50-foot long colonial, which is worm-shaped, and how I justify putting them on the list. These aggregates reproduce sexually. Salps are remarkably important because their detritus and corpses are like the whale falls of the deep sea. I guess that would be whale falls. But the point is, salps are really important for getting carbon and nutrients to the bottom of the ocean. And that's so many cool things to love about salps. So they go in Salp tier, which is S tier. A jelly worm is a fishing lure sold by Man's Bait Company. Well, they manufacture. Most of the time it's sold by some retailer. Obvious thing out of the way first, I got a man's jelly worm for you right here, devil emoji. But that doesn't quite hit as hard when we already have something called the penis worm in C tier. Now, I don't love fishing, fly fishing, bait fishing, or lure fishing, and I don't really like fish all that much. Even in Minecraft, it just kind of feels like a chore. I know a lot of people do like it, certainly had a bunch of professors this season that wouldn't shut up, but that was mostly fly fishing, which I can kind of see the appeal, though for me it conjures up all these horrible images of tangled up fishing lines. I don't really have anything against it, and I usually reserve F tier for that, so congratulations, fishing as a whole, and more importantly the jelly worm, you're going to D tier. When Tierzoo shamelessly ripped off my video, he put the Hammerhead Worm as the winning worm with the highest rank. At least the summary said he did. I stopped watching when he put earthworms in F tier. I mean, yeah, I know his videos are ranking like an individual's experience, but how could you do this? This seems so much like pandering to the crowd who just wants to see wacky animals they've never heard of. If this man was a fish, he would be Panderichthyes. What were we talking about? Hammerhead worms, right. So, hammerhead worms are flatworms like the tapeworm, and no other worms that were interesting enough to put on this list. That doesn't bode well. Hammerhead worms are largely similar to other flatworms in that they have amazing regenerative abilities. You can cut one in half and get two more. Well, one more, two total, whatever. Hammerhead worms have aggressive rhabdites and produce a bunch of mucus that they use to move around and hunt and kill earthworms. Oh, of course, that's why they ended up in F tier. He needed to prop up his precious hammerhead flatworms. You know what? These guys are so poisonous, they have no natural predators because they're invasive. We should be doing everything we can to kill these little creeps. Oh, is that anti-nature? Bad take? Who cares? So what? Maybe I just want an excuse to kill something because I hate animals, and I hate Tierzoo, and I hate all of you, and I hate hammerhead flatworms. F tier. Tongue worms are a new representative from a group, the crustaceans, that haven't gone on the list yet. Well, all insects are technically crustaceans, but that's not the point. Tongue worms are called that because they look like tongues, not like the tongue-eating louse where they have some strange relationship with the tongues of another creature. Unlike most other endoparasites, yes, they're another endoparasite, tongue worms don't live in the digestive tract, rather they live in the respiratory system and feed on mucus and blood. Now, getting there is a bit harder than the intestines, so they have to crawl back up the throat. Disgusting. They also have an intermediate host, oh joy, where they instead burrow out of the digestive tract and make random cysts throughout the body, though that's usually just rodents and lagomorphs. So yes, woo, they're super interesting. I don't want a worm crawling up my throat, living in my nose, and eating my snot. What the heck? F tier. Arrow worms are kind of hard to care about. It's a common name, common in quotes, for chitognaths, which are a tiny little thing that live in the water column. Now, despite being a tiny little thing, chitognaths seem like relatively complex organisms. They have a coelom, they're symmetrical, they have mating habits despite being hermaphroditic, and their self-fertilization is a backup, the way it really should be in hermaphrodites. They live their entire life as plankton in the water column, feeding on other zooplankton. They hunt using sensory hairs to detect motion. When you're that small, water physics are weird, so you can just kind of lie in wait while floating. And they use modified sensory hairs, almost like teeth. Like they've got some kind of bristle jaws. Imagine that. This is remarkably successful. They make up nearly a quarter of all zooplanktonic mass. And let's not forget how many high tiers are filter or suspension feeders and need plankton to survive. I'm thinking S tier again already. Computer worms are technically separate to viruses or viri, but nowadays pretty much all malware is lazily called a virus. It makes copies of itself and they don't require you to give permission to them or even a host program for you to download. which was alarming to read. Fortunately, they spread by exploiting vulnerabilities in a system, and most computers nowadays just don't really have any vulnerabilities. I mean, with like LAN and public Wi-Fi, maybe I really don't know. I guess you could always be more secure, which is why today's video is sponsored by NordVPN. Yeah, C tier, who cares? Leeches do not include the word worm, but they are a perfect example of a segmented worm. In fact, they all have 32 segments. They're not the only parasitic segmented worm, but they might as well be. And they're not even an endoparasite. I'm sure you're familiar with the gist of leeches. They latch onto you with their sucker and they suck blood out of you. Notably, the sucker is not the part that sucks. This acetabulum is on the posterior end, opposite the head, which is really small. Yeah, I don't like parasites, as you might have figured out by now. Exoparasites are a lot more lenient, except maybe mosquitoes, but that's because they vector a bunch of evil diseases. Yes, I don't love that they inject the anticoagulant. I don't really like having things put into my veins, but also there's probably a bunch of important medical stuff we need it for. Overall, it's kind of hard to find a reason to hate leeches, even though I probably should. So B tier. Horsehair or Gordian worms are not technically roundworms. They're not nematodes. They're nematoids, which will only become more fun to say as the oid suffix becomes increasingly memed. You've probably heard of these guys, probably from the semi-famous video on Reddit of the mantis with tentacles growing out of it. That's right, it's another endoparasite. Now, these ones exclusively affect insects, so I can't really hold it against them. My main gripe with parasites is imagining them affecting me. What do I care if some random mantis has worms up their butt? I guess that's a bit unempathetic, but it's a bug. Now, like the cordyceps fungus, they can sort of mind control the host to further their own reproductive interests. Unlike the fungus, they can also use horizontal gene transfer to steal the host's DNA and use it against them, which also means they aren't stuck adapted to one single specific host. This video has been a bit negative so far, so I'll give it a sweet A tier. Wormwood is an herb native to Europe and North Africa. It is very bitter and used to flavor some alcohols. Like a lot of natural flavorings, it is technically poisonous, specifically containing a chemical called thujone, and like a lot of technically poisonous plants, there's a moth that eats it and becomes poisonous. Wormwood is used frequently throughout the Bible as a metaphor for anything undesirable, like turning away from God, and also just casually is a star that falls into the ocean and kills 1/3 of all waters. And so what if it is bitter? I like bitter. I like licorice. This isn't even about licorice, but I still defend my thujone. I like my glycyrrhizin. I don't mess with 1/3 of the population dying, so I will bump it down to C tier. And that's the whole thing. Obviously not. I still have even more to get through, but that's all we have time for this week. Goodbye, good night, and good enough. That's a real person's name.